Hi, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on collaborative prismatic inquiry, where we examine the initial impacts on education during a pandemic. By integrating the experiences of multiple people, from educators to parents, we seek to explore how educating during the pandemic, especially the first 6 months, has been for those of us working on the front lines of education. We hope to provide insight into what has been working, what has been challenging, and overall impressions of this experience through qualitative inquiry. Across all participants, several themes emerged from their experiences that offer ideas on how education can adapt during this challenging time. In this presentation, we'll provide you with the purpose and significance of our research, as well as the literature that situates the questions we asked. We'll also be putting forth inquiry questions to you, as well as explaining our methodology and analysis. And we'll conclude by going over the results of our work with you.
In this study, a group of educators, college professors, administrators, parents, and students came together to tell their stories through collaborative prismatic inquiry. The main objectives were to document this historical event from multiple perspectives and to determine if there were problems or successes that crossed all educational levels.
As the COVID-19 pandemic develops second waves across the world and continues a rising crest in the United States and California, its impact on the future of teachers' education, and education lie in a constant flux between politics, healthcare warnings, inequality, public voices, and pandemic impacts. An examination of what was problematic and what worked across stakeholders' experiences in the initial transition to pandemic education offers crumbs for how to be stronger while education continues to navigate the ongoing liminality and stress of the pandemic.
Our literature review examined the components and benefits of educational theory. Engagement, sharing, connection, reflection, and learning are more productive when students and educators are happy and safe. Quality education in the classroom calls for high student engagement, with which student building relationships and furthermore, building connections with each other helps students overcome their trauma symptoms. Education needs a space where students' voices are heard and democratic practices are seen, which improve educational success. Teaching the whole child requires moving beyond a basic curriculum to include emotional intelligence, social cognition, and coping mechanisms.
And now we'd like to put forth some questions to you. There's been a lot of focus on the challenges and negatives of trying to educate during a pandemic. So how do you feel that the pandemic has given you new opportunities where education and your work is concerned? Given the constraints of the pandemic, if you could design an ideal education program or classroom, what would that look like for you in your setting? And secondly, what do you think the top 1 or 2 challenges have been for you since this pandemic started, and how have you tried to address them? As the pandemic has continued, do you feel you've become more adept at managing this new environment? What changes would you like to make?
For our methodology, our framework was prismatic theory, and our methodology was collaborative prismatic inquiry. The prismatic lens, which emerges out of Deleuze and Guattari's rhizomatic theory, uses multiple perspectives when looking at education in order to better examine what might be obscured by the dominant narrative or part of the hidden curriculum. Using this lens to examine pandemic education focuses first on telling the authentic stories of people impacted by COVID-19's effects on education, then on understanding the patterns and pitfalls across educational levels and subjects.
When the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States, the shift of all academics from the classroom to digital impacted every level of education. In this prismatic collection of stories, a team of educators, parents, and students answer the prompt about perceptions of education during the initial transition to online teaching during the COVID-19 emergency. 1, what was working? 2, what needed to be improved? And 3, overall impressions of education during COVID-19. This collection of stories targets the specific window of the initial transition to pandemic education, which hit education with little warning, but will forever remain a part of educational history.
Perspectives included are that of a graduating high school student, a blue-collar working mother of middle school and high school-aged children, a white-collar mother of a toddler, a white-collar mother of elementary-aged children, a seasoned elementary teacher, a K-8 administrator, a credential student, a first-year special education teacher, an undergraduate biology and anthropology professor, an undergraduate English professor, and a graduate education professor. Each researcher wrote their own story following the prompt. Stories were then organized by identity and layered over one another to identify patterns.
Our analysis went through a series of data cycles. Following the pattern of grounded theory, each cycle informs and builds towards the next. This paired with prismatic inquiry, which looks for intuitive and the unseen. Stories were first run through in vivo to check for word frequency, and then second, all the stories were read through with an intuitive sense for preliminary codes. Third, stories were read line by line to code line by line, using preliminary codes and adding additional codes as patterns emerged. Finally, core themes were identified.
Running all stories through in vivo highlighted the focus on students across all voices. Some students found learning online easier than face-to-face, while others needed parent motivation to keep moving. For adult learners, family responsibilities, illness, job changes due to being essential workers or being laid off affected their availability for learning. For children, keeping them on track with learning became harder. Overall, solid communication was important and sometimes lacking. The importance and problems with communication demonstrated how, within the dearth of certain knowledge, some kept stakeholders well informed, some needed time to develop solid patterns of communication, and some found themselves taking action in the face of radio silence.
The focus on standards and curriculum content varied. Problems with access for parents and students to resources emerged. Special education services typically took a hit because students did not show up to access resources. Most educators participating in the research were able to transition to online education with extensive work on part of the teachers. Hands-on science labs were nearly impossible to replicate. Educators with children struggled to balance home and work, while mothers found themselves to be the cornerstone of the stay-at-home juggling work, school, children's learning, and household chores. One first-year teacher found that they were less overloaded and used time to reach out to parents. But most educators found that teaching online, both the preparation and execution of the curriculum, took significantly more time than teaching face-to-face in the classroom.
Foresight on the part of educational leaders was often helpful. Leaders who watched international and national news, who either had a background in science or were willing to trust the medical and scientific community, were able to put measures in place before the president and governor chose to shut down the state. This resulted in more planning time for educators. The development of a community promoting flexible thinking, collaboration, and technology integration also added a level of success if these were already in place. Additionally, educators who worked with a team meant their team as a whole was more productive and successful with teaching students. Two key components also emerged: exhaustion and social emotional needs. Educators and parents alike found themselves exhausted. Standards could be hit, curriculum could be provided, but students also needed a way to connect outside of curriculum content. As one story noted, school is so much more than academics.
Lastly, we'd like to leave you with our list of references that helped us inform the research that we did today. And I'd also like to mention that on our title slide, as well as our concluding slide, there is a link at the bottom where you can access our entire presentation so you have access to all this material. Thank you for joining us today.